Patrick Fell Down by Seak Goodman. Copyright 2017. All rights reserved. Many years ago, there lived two children named Patrick and Brandon. They lived on a small farm in a little place called Sunnyside Acres. One day, the two children were playing in the field when suddenly Patrick disappeared from view. Brandon thought that perhaps Patrick was playing some sort of joke. Brandon called his name several times and began to get quite worried after several minutes. It was getting dark, so Brandon headed back to the house thinking that perhaps Patrick had left him out in the field. He arrived back home and found no sign of Patrick. His mother asked him where his brother was. Brandon told his mother how he'd left him in the field and he was sure he was playing some sort of joke on him. Her mother was not so convinced. She quickly grabbed the flashlight that was kept on the counter, ran out the door towards the field. Brandon stayed behind as he was convinced that Patrick would be in a lot of trouble. He did not want to hear a lot of shouting and screaming. Several hours went by and Brandon began to get very concerned that his mother and Patrick had not returned. His mother had taken the only flashlight, so all he had was a small keychain light that would barely give illumination a few feet in front of him. Out the door Brandon went with his small keychain flashlight, beaming a small circle in front of himself from which to see by. The field was a good distance from the house, and Brandon was a little bit afraid as the wind was blowing in the darkness and the coolness of the evening gave him a bit of a spooky feeling. Brandon called for his mother and Patrick. No sounds were heard. Brandon began to get very worried and started to cry. He knew that something had happened to them both, and he felt the responsibility that had fallen on his shoulders. Brandon returned to the exact spot where Patrick disappeared. As best he could tell, the wind was howling quite a bit through the trees with an eerie voice all its own. Brandon cried out with all his might for his mother. A very small voice was heard beneath the sound of the wind blowing across the field. Brandon let out another yell, this time calling for Patrick. The voice again returned, and Brandon was able to get a bearing on the sound he was hearing. He walked cautiously, looking at the small beam of light that was in front of him from the keychain. He called his mother's name, and her voice returned, this time a little louder. He kept walking and calling their names over and over until he reached the edge of a dark hole from which no light returned from the flashlight. A cold sweat was felt on Brandon's back as he directed his voice down into the hole. "Are you down there?" "Yes, we are. Go and get help as quickly as you can," his mother's voice returned. "Don't worry, I'll be right back," Brandon shouted. Brandon took off towards the house, his feet barely touching the ground. His small flashlight became of little consequence as he was guided by sheer determination. He ran into the barn and grabbed an old rope that had been hanging there for years. Normally, this barn would have scared him quite a bit. It was full of spiders and all sorts of critters that inhabited the darkness. Brandon was not scared at all and gave little thought to the small flashlight that was becoming yellow with use. He ran back out to the field to where the hole was, slowing before he got there to avoid falling in. He threw the rope down into the hole. "Tie yourselves on. I'll be back to pull you up." Brandon did not even wait for a reply from the dark hole. He ran toward the house with everything he had. He ran inside and grabbed his mother's keys from off the kitchen table. He'd never driven the old truck before, but he'd seen his mother drive it many times. He hopped in the cab of the truck and slammed the creaky door. The motor turned over sluggishly several times and then fired to life. Brandon struggled to reach the pedals and managed to push in the clutch and shove the gear shift forward. With a grinding sound, the transmission found a gear and he released the clutch slowly, as he'd seen his mother do many times before. The truck lurched forward, hopping several times as Brandon's foot struggled to stay upon the pedals. He reached up and pulled on the lights so he could see where he was driving. He pointed the truck towards the field and managed to miss the fence as he drove through the gate with the motor revving high in low gear. He knew he had to shift to go faster, so he pushed in the clutch and pulled the stick backwards and released the pedal. The truck leaped forward, finding second gear. Brandon navigated around several old tree stumps, spinning the tires as he floored the engine. He reached the hole quickly and slammed on the brake, forgetting the clutch altogether. The engine stalled. He hopped out and ran to the edge of the hole. Grabbing the end of the rope, he returned to the bumper. He tied the best knot he could. He went back and shouted down the well. "Are you ready to be pulled out?"
Yes, we're ready.
The voices came from the darkness. Brandon ran back to the truck, pushed in the clutch, started the motor, and leaned the gear shift to the far right and pulled it backwards, as he'd often seen his mother do when backing out of the driveway. He knew he would have to go slowly, so he cautiously released the clutch, keeping tension on it. The old truck creaked into motion. He watched the rope grow in length, coming slowly from the hole. Brandon kept backing up and watching for any sign of his mother and Patrick. Soon, he saw his mother's face, followed by his brother Patrick, covered in mud. Brandon turned the key, shutting off the motor. He hopped out, slamming the old door, and ran to see them. He hugged them and began to cry with joy, seeing that they were unharmed. "Who was driving the truck?" his mother asked. "I was, Mother," Brandon said. His mother's eyes looked at him disbelieving. His brother Patrick, who had been down the hole the longest, turned to his brother and said, "You're going to be in a lot of trouble for driving the truck." And their mother began to laugh. "I think we'll let it go this time." His mother rolled up the rope and threw it in the back of the truck, and they returned to the old barn. She stopped the truck and turned to Patrick and said, "Go and put that rope in the barn." Patrick looked at her with disbelief. "I'm scared to go in that barn. If your brother can do it, you sure can. Get moving." Patrick made a discouraged face and then headed to the barn with the muddy rope dragging behind him. "Would you like me to drive to the store and get some dinner, Mom?" Brandon said, smiling. She turned to him and laughed. They sat chuckling in the truck as the end of the rope disappeared through the door into the darkness of the barn with a quick tug. The end. View more books by this author at seekstars.com.